So hello and welcome to another episode of Biographics. I'm your host, Karl Smallwood, and today we're talking about something specifically for the spooky season. Specifically, the Fox sisters, the frauds who helped found Spiritualism. I should mention, like all of our videos, this one is based on original articles submitted by a member of our team of handsome, well-endowed writers. This one being Larry Holsworth. You can find links to their socials below. Let's get to it. Spiritualism, a belief in an afterlife where the spirits of the dead retain some conscious awareness of the world around them and can communicate with the living, began to take hold in Britain and the United States in the mid to late 19th century. The belief in a life after death included the acceptance that spirits were more ethically and morally advanced than the living, could therefore provide moral guidance to us still shuffling along this mortal coil. As a result, a new type of fortune teller emerged, the medium, one who possessed the ability to communicate with the spirits of the dead. Mediums served as a bridge of sorts between the living and the dead, using several different means of exchanging messages, most of them confusing and most of them conveniently very easily faked. The means of communication evolved over the years. In the beginning, communication consisted mainly of small rapping noises, think fingers rapping on a desk or small cracking noises. However would you fake that? The medium questioned the spirit, asking it to reply with a specific number of raps. Later communication, though, included spirit writing, moans and shrieks, movement of objects about a room, drafts, and so on and so forth. Spiritualism's roots can be traced to upstate New York, where it emerged during a period of religious revival in the 1840s. Among its earliest proponents were three sisters who hailed from Hydesville near Rochester, on the shores of Lake Erie near the Genesee River. And it's quite convenient they were born near Lake Erie and they could communicate with ghosts. That's very fitting. Leah Margaretta, henceforth referred to as Maggie because that's the name she went by, and Catherine Fox were raised in the Methodist faith. The sisters had been born in Ontario before relocating to Hydesville in 1847. Leah, the eldest of the three, was born in 1813. Maggie was 20 years younger, born in 1833, while Catherine, who preferred to be called Kate, was born in 1837. In 1848, the younger two sisters began to claim their Hydesville home was haunted, reporting mysterious sounds at night, including inexplicable rapping noises. Concerned, their parents sent the sisters to relatives and acquaintances in Rochester. The girls reported the rapping sounds followed them to their new homes. When a prominent Quaker family learned of the strange reports of the sisters, they spread the word to their weekly meetings. Through the Quakers, the spiritualist movement began and grew rapidly. The sisters became local and later international celebrities. They remain leading figures in spiritualism well into the 21st century. As the spiritualist movement grew, an argument began over whether it was, kind of bad to, taunt ghosts. Proponents argued that if one believed in angels, devils, and the afterlife, all part of the Christian dogma, one must necessarily believe in the existence of the immortal soul. Therefore, communication with that immortal soul was not in any way immoral. You're just talking to something that you all believe exists. It's not witchcraft or heresy, right? But why some possessed this ability and others did not was the matter of some debate, and later arguments against spiritualism were based largely on science rather than biblical verses, but that's besides the point, and we're getting far ahead of ourselves. Whether some humans do actually possess the ability to communicate with the dead is an argument which still rages, and countless mediums still practice it today.
Will Michael answer a question?
Yes, he would like this.
The strange rappings that the sisters reported they had heard in their Hydesville home took on a more sinister aura when rumours began to circulate there had been a murder on the property some years before. Prominent citizens of Rochester searched the home and nearby barn, and though they did not uncover any clear evidence of a murder, that is, any evidence whatsoever, the rumour was just too good to fade. Supposedly, a travelling peddler had been killed, explaining why there had been no reports of a missing person at the time. The story also provided a convenient means of explaining why an upset spirit occupied the home itself. In addition, the area surrounding Rochester had long been one where religious activity abounded, to the point it had gained the name of the Burned Over District. Mormonism had emerged in the area in the 1820s, and what eventually became Seventh-day Adventism began in the region, an extension of the teachings of William Miller, who had prophesied the second coming of Jesus Christ, which would occur in the mid to early 1840s. So 200 years out almost? Still time. Go on, fingers crossed, come on! The region had been a hotbed of the Shaker sect and was home to utopian experiments, revival meetings, and other similar activities. And now, ghosts who could communicate by doing this. When word spread around Rochester and its environs that the strange rapping sounds reported in the Foxes' Hydesville home had evidently followed the sisters to Rochester, where both reported continuing to hear them despite living in separate residences, public interest grew. The sisters gained the reputation of being able to communicate with the dead, thus giving proof of an afterlife and a link to the eternal knowledge contained therein. In Rochester, a guy called Isaac Post and his wife Amy contacted the sisters through Leah, who by then had also claimed to possess the same extraordinary power as her younger sisters. Both Posts were considered dangerous radicals by the more conservative citizens of Rochester. So, what could they have possibly done to be considered so radical, you ask? Well, Isaac was the leader of a breakaway sect of the Society of Friends, known as the Hicksites. He was also a leading abolitionist, a conductor of the Underground Railroad, and a supporter of the formerly enslaved Frederick Douglass. Post actually helped Douglass establish his newspaper, the North Star. As for his wife, she was considered even more radical than her husband because in addition to supporting the rights of black people, she also supported women's suffrage. That's what was considered radical at the time. Just to, put into perspective the era we're talking about here. The Posts invited the Fox sisters to demonstrate their abilities in their home in a seance attended by several of their influential friends. Isaac Post later recounted that he had entered the meeting as a doubter, writing, and I quote, "I suppose I went with as much unbelief as Thomas felt when he was introduced to Jesus after he had ascended. The girls, however, managed to convince him that they could indeed communicate with the dead, as they did for nearly all the witnesses present during that first fateful seance." Later, Leah convinced the Post that she had received communications from their recently deceased daughter. Isaac rented the newly built Corinthian Hall in Rochester. 400 tickets were sold for a demonstration of the sisters' remarkable abilities, which took place on November 14th, 1849. Skeptics were invited to attend and to examine the girls following the demonstration to determine whether any trickery whatsoever was involved. And though several skeptics did attend and the girls were examined quite thoroughly following the demonstration, no evidence of trickery was found. Andrew Jackson Davis was a lightly educated charlatan who believed he possessed the ability to diagnose and cure illness through magnetism, which is now known as hypnotism, although both would be equally as likely. He also claimed to be a clairvoyant. In 1845, he dictated a book to an assistant while in a trance. He believed that while he was in this trance, he received the very secrets of nature itself, and in 1847 published those findings in a book titled The Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelations and a Voice to Mankind. So one critic savaged the book, stating it was a very crude and badly digested mess of early scientific literature. Why am I so bad at pronouncing literature? He subsequently published several more works with equally foreboding titles, and once claimed to have been shown what he called Summerland. He described Summerland as the place where souls reside after death. It's like, nah man, Valhalla for this dude. I was brought into this world screaming covered in blood. That's the way I'm going to leave it. And that's a joke and a reference to The Simpsons. So Davis had heard of the sisters' success in Rochester and invited them to visit him at his home in New York. Davis was one of the early proponents of the growing belief in spiritualism and foresaw that linking his work to theirs would, advance this cause, as well as, make them lots and lots of money. You got to get that Dutch Vandalier on and make that money. So Leah, Kate, and Maggie travelled to New York, established themselves in Barnum's Hotel, and held scheduled seances 3 times a day, every day in the parlour. There were, of course, skeptics, including Scientific American, which derided them as frauds, yet many influential New Yorkers and visitors to the city attended the sessions, observing their communications with the dead for the price of $1. As many as 30 people could attend each session, and the sisters graciously arranged for private sittings when desired, for a price. After their success in New York, which was dutifully reported in the newspapers and magazines, Kate and Maggie departed, taking their show on the road. They travelled the major eastern cities, going as far west as St. Louis and to the nation's capital, then known as Washington City. In Washington, Maggie was approached by Jane Pierce, the wife of Franklin Pierce. Their son Benjamin had died in a train wreck as they journeyed to Washington for Franklin's inauguration as the President of the United States. The seance was held privately, and its results are also private, so we don't actually know what went on, but it's interesting nonetheless. By 1852, Maggie and Kate were in Philadelphia, where they met Elisha Kent Kane. Kane was nearly as famous as the Fox sisters, but for, shall we say, entirely different reasons. As the sisters performed their seances and helped spread belief in spiritualism, Kane served as a United States Naval Medical Officer and accompanied several expeditions to the Arctic. He was a famed public speaker, giving lectures on Arctic exploration, navigation, medicine, and nutrition. He was a man of science and of common sense, and he was absolutely convinced that the Fox sisters were frauds. He was also convinced that one of the Fox sisters was a fox. So When he failed to uncover any evidence of how they generate the strange rapping noises which was featured in their performances, he decided that he was just going to try to sleep with one of them. Specifically, the sister he was after was Maggie, who was at the time 19 years of age. Ew. Some accounts, including Maggie's own, claim that they were married in 1856, after which she renounced spiritualism and eventually converted to Catholicism. Cain was a Presbyterian. Following his death in 1857, Maggie initiated lawsuits with his family over his estate, the settlements of which remained murky. Although she claimed to have renounced spiritualism, she eventually returned to it and renewed her claim that she could indeed communicate with the dead. At which point, surely the court case against her deceased former husband would be really easy to prove, because you could just ask him. In 1866, Maggie published a book titled The Love Life of Dr. Cain. It contained copies of the correspondence between Maggie and the noted explorer, including references to their secret marriage. It also contained a history of their relationship written by an unidentified writer. Maggie's letters appear in the book, as do those of Elijah Cain, but she was not identified as the writer of the text itself. Although, come on. During her sister's romantic interlude, Kate continued to enhance and develop her spiritual and psychic powers. By the early 1870s, she was no longer dependent solely on coded rapping in her communications. She demonstrated the ability to receive messages through spirit writing while simultaneously receiving another, which she would repeat verbally. Unsurprisingly, in the aftermath of the Civil War, grieving families and widows sought solace and her business boomed. Yeah. So I was going to make a joke about powering up like she was in the 1870s version of Cerebro, but then you just get crashed back down to earth by the fact she was exploiting the grief of people whose families had recently died. It's a predatory, awful business. The Civil War was good for the spiritualist movement in general, as more and more people abandoned more traditional faiths and sought to communicate with lost loved ones. Maggie returned to spiritualism during the war, and both sisters began to include wine in their seances. By the war's end, both were encountering problems with their drinking. In the Gilded Age, spiritualism boomed. The Fox sisters were far from the only practitioners of seances and communicating with the dead, though they were in some ways among the most flamboyant. Kate once claimed to have conjured the spirit of Benjamin Franklin himself, who identified himself by signing his name. How could you fake that? Other practitioners convinced their followers of the validity of their claims using the emerging technology of photographs. William Mumler was one such spiritualist who was consulted by Mary Todd Lincoln following the assassination of her husband. Yes, we're talking about that Lincoln. So Mumler produced a photograph in which the image of the dead president stands behind his widow, his hands resting gently on her shoulder. In case it wasn't clear, it was fake. So the image was reproduced in newspapers and in magazines, piquing the interest of readers in the practice. It's worth noting that spiritualism wasn't just limited to America. In Great Britain, spiritualists and clairvoyants plied their trade, with many of the most famous coming to America to consult with their fellows and, make money. One of the most fervid believers in spiritualism was none other than famed British writer Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. And we've actually talked about that in another Biographics video, which will no doubt be linked on screen or down below. Regardless, Arthur Conan Doyle's writings on the defense of the paranormal and its existence were popular on both sides of the Atlantic. And just fun fact, Arthur Conan Doyle stopped being friends with Harry Houdini, who is mentioned later in this video as one of the people who debunked spiritualism as a whole, because he believed that Harry Houdini was a wizard who used his wizard powers to suppress the powers of other lesser wizards. Yeah, and just Houdini got so sick of Arthur Conan Doyle saying, "You're a wizard." He's like, "I'm not a wizard, I'm a magician. It's all fake, it's a trick." He's like, "No, you're a wizard, you're using your wizard powers. Stop calling me a wizard." So the Fox sisters were among the first, and by the Gilded Age, the most famous spiritualists in the world. And for over 3 decades, they had conducted seances and demonstrations of their power, and survived all the calls of fraud and deception which had been harried their way. And by this point, all three had married, and Maggie by then was actually a widow, if her claims regarding Cain were true. During an 1872 trip to London, Kate married a barrister named Jenkin, providing her with 2 sons. Leah, who by then was on her second husband, her first having died. The sisters then fell out with each other, leading to their downfall. And just for a moment, let's just put yourself in the boots of a guy. He's you're approaching a girl, and she's a widow. You're oh no, that sucks. You want to go on a date? It's yeah, cool. And on that date, she reveals that she is a spiritualist and communicate with the dead. How much of a horn dog do you have to be to continue pursuing that relationship when the person you're talking to has confirmed to you that they can communicate with the dead? It's Surely the husband who passed away is going to make that awkward, right? Surely?
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
It began with Leia. She had, throughout the sisters' careers, controlled virtually everything about their lives, their appearances, their schedules, and their public image. From her lofty perch as the eldest sister she had created, the frequently grinding schedules, the conversation with the writers and newspapers, and virtually all aspects of their joint careers. By the mid-1880s, Maggie and Kate were chafing under her thumb, and both had begun drinking heavily. Kate's drinking in particular was a concern, and Leia enlisted the support of another leading spiritualist in remonstrating her with her wayward sister. Leia would later express publicly that Kate's excessive drinking was bad for both her spiritualism and for her 2 children. Not mentioned was, the money. So Kate and Maggie had always been closer with each other than their much older sister, who remember was 2 decades their senior. And Maggie was particularly angry with what she perceived as attacks on Kate. Without Leia's knowledge, Maggie booked an appearance in New York at the Academy of Music for October 21st, 1888. That day, an interview appeared in which Maggie informed the New York World of her intention to announce that the sisters' entire 4-decade career as spiritualists and mediums had been an elaborate fraud. The World paid her $1,500 for a confession, the modern equivalent of just under $50,000. So Maggie's interview in the New York World ensured that her appearance at the Academy of Music was well attended. Spiritualists, deniers, debunkers and reporters packed the hall tight. Maggie addressed the audience with a disarming candour, referring to their performances and claims to receive messages from the dead as, and I quote, a horrible deception, which had begun in their Hinesville home years before as a simple prank. She claimed that the girls had first created the rapping sounds by, I kid you not folks at home, dragging an apple across the floor with a string. According to Maggie, the later rapping sounds that were heard in many of their seances were made by their knuckles, ankles, toes, and knees, which they cracked to produce the sounds. And for anyone out there who thinks that sounds kind of unbelievable, as someone who possesses creaky bonitis and can crack a lot of their joints and bones at will, I will demonstrate now. But as a warning, you can turn it down. The person who's capable of doing this. But now imagine that in a really old, creaky hall, and you're doing it on a wooden floor, because that's what the sisters would do. She also pointed out that during their seances, individuals eager for contact with lost loved ones contributed to the illusion. The rapping sounds caused many to imagine or believe they had felt physical contact, a touch on the arm, the hand, or on the shoulder. She would state it's a very common delusion and one we saw a lot. In particular, Maggie recalled a very early seance after which she generated a rapping sound. Her client said that she felt the spirit tapping me on the shoulder. Of course, Maggie added that was pure imagination. For all of the naysayers of her naysaying, she did offer to demonstrate this ability, and according to the report of the New York Herald, claimed that it was in this way she created the excitement that has driven so many persons to suicide or insanity. Maggie demonstrated her ability to create rapping sounds using her toes, cracking them at will, and producing sounds magnified by the room. The trick she would use is she would crack her toes, ankles, rolling her feet and stuff on the hard wooden floor. And you might think, well, surely you'd notice that, right? Right? You'd just notice if all they were doing is just cracking their toes over and over again. You have to keep in mind, folks, that the dress of the time was long, flowing ones that didn't reveal any of that sexy ankle, allowing the sisters to just hide what they were doing from onlookers. As for how she developed this astonishing ability to crack her bones at will, according to Maggie, her and Kate just practiced it as children, and she also additionally claimed that her older sister was always aware of the deception and has sought to abuse it for financial gain. Perhaps the most withering thing Maggie claimed, though, is that her confession was pretty much the nail in the coffin at the idea of spiritualism, because it basically proved that the entire thing was based on fraudulent exploitation of the emotions of those seeking contact with the dead. She closed her remarks with gratitude for finally clearing her conscience and revealing the deception. While a lot of skeptics used Maggie's confession to proclaim the end of spiritualism, others were not so sanguine. Leading spiritualists were not about to let their believers go away, read cash cows, disenchanted by what Maggie had revealed. They charged that Maggie had been driven to attack spiritualism for financial gain. The irony, having lost much of her audience of believers following her conversion to Catholicism. Others claim that Maggie and presumably her sisters were genuine spiritualists and their contacts with the other side were legitimate. They argued that Maggie's more recent pronouncements were caused by spirits intent on harming humanity. Yeah, this is what they did. In effect, they argued that Maggie had been seized by evil spirits. The devil made her do it. So it's she can communicate with the spirits, but the spirits are lying about her being able to communicate with the spirits. for reasons. So whatever her motive may have been, within the year, Maggie recanted her entire confession and speech of October 21st. She appeared to have waffled back and forth for the next few years, claiming intermittently to have the powers to receive messages from the dead and appearing incognito at various gatherings of spiritualists to debunk their methods of communication. She was a complicated person, to say the least, and I'm guessing, the alcohol had something to do with that. She remained estranged from Leia, and both sisters lost track of Kate. Despite her recanting and returning to spiritualism, Maggie failed to generate much interest in her seances. Impoverished, she wandered about Brooklyn, living on handouts. Kate died in 1892 in New York City. Maggie slipped deeper into alcoholism and within a few months was living in a tenement, supported solely by charity. Another spiritualist, Emily Ruggles, took pity on her and moved her into her home in Brooklyn, where she died in March 1893. The once celebrated Margaret Fox joins the spirits. In fact, read her obituary headline in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Leia had preceded her younger sisters in death in 1890, yet to many spiritualists the sisters did not die, and they remained a major influence on the spiritualism movement as it continued to expand well into the 20th century, and even to this day. Spiritualism continued to grow and expand in the first half of the 20th century and experienced a boom of sorts following the global catastrophes of the First World War and the Spanish flu pandemic. In 1902, Frank Podmore, an English physical researcher and skeptic of spiritualism, wrote an influential book on the subject titled simply Modern Spiritualism. Podmore related several examples of the Fox sisters' communications with the dead, as well as Maggie's description of the fraud they had perpetrated. Yet he also stressed that both Maggie and Kate had later recanted the confession. Though Podmore was a self-described skeptic regarding spiritual communications, he was a believer in both telepathic communications and the existence of ghosts. He just didn't believe that you could use one to communicate with the other, which is a very strange things to believe in tandem, but I guess people are complicated. So Podmore postulated that ghosts did communicate with the living through telepathic means, including in dreams. He was just skeptical that the Fox sisters were able to do so. In 1926, Arthur Conan Doyle, mentioned previously, published The History of Spiritualism. He too recounted the story of the Fox sisters, focusing on their spiritual communications with the dead and ignored the accounts of fraud completely, including the ones admitted by themselves. So do you remember earlier in this video where I talked about the rumours of a peddler who died on the property the sisters grew up on? Arthur Conan Doyle recounted that story in his book, but failed to mention the fact that no body was found. In fact, he noted that they found bones on the property. He failed to note that those bones belonged to a chicken, but bones. It probably also won't surprise you to learn that Arthur Conan Doyle failed to mention or discuss the many investigations into the sisters during their careers and the findings of skeptics, which were eventually confirmed by Maggie's own confession. There are a lot of these, by the way. So throughout the sisters' careers, skeptics had investigated their communications, with several reporting that the strange rapping noises were self-created by means of cracking of the joints. According to these skeptics, the sisters favoured using their toes and ankles for such noises, since the long skirts of the day concealed their movements. In one study, the sisters were seated on a sofa rather than the hard circular table favoured for their seances. Their feet were placed on cushions around the wood floors typical of most seance seatings. When the sisters failed to produce any rapping sounds, they blamed the failures on the absence of cooperative spirits. Despite all this, supporters of spiritualism continued to expand upon the numerous abilities and career of the Fox sisters for decades, and still do to the present day, despite, the lie. As the idea of communicating with spirits grew, the Fox sisters became symbolic of its beginnings. They are often cited as the founders of spiritualism itself, an erroneous assertion, though they were among its earliest and best-known practitioners. Their position as founders came from none other than the famed vaudevillian Harry Houdini. So in 1925, the illusionist and escape artist Harry Houdini published an article titled "How I Unmask the Spirit Fakers." In his article, Houdini mentioned that subsequent mediums continued to exploit the same tricks used by the Fox sisters to delude their subjects. Houdini referred to practicing spiritualist mediums as vultures, and that they were, and I quote, "the most contemptible and meanest criminals that walk the earth." He then stated that, and I quote once again, "the Fox sisters, Margaret and Kate, were the founders of spiritualism as it is known today." Houdini described how the sisters developed their skills creating rapping sounds and added, once again I'm quoting here, "An older sister saw commercial possibilities in the odd accomplishments of the children and exploited them widely." He concluded, and I quote one final time, "That was the beginning of spiritualism." And as an aside here, if anyone curious about why Harry Houdini had such a hard-on for debunking spiritualists, like many people, he was a believer initially in the idea of communicating with spirits, because it was a prevalent thing at the time. And he was completely sideswiped and turned off the idea when he went to see a medium following the death of his mother. And he asked the medium, can you communicate with my mother? I'd like to know if she's okay. Can you do that for me? And the medium's like, say no more. Went through the usual spiel. Oh, I'm in contact with your mother now, Mr. Houdini. And Houdini obviously asked, like, what did she say? To which the spiritualist replied, she says, Harry, it's okay. Which confused Houdini, who asked the spiritualist, why did she call me Harry? To which the spiritualist responded, well, that's your name. To which Houdini responded, no, it's not. My mother doesn't call me Harry. She also doesn't speak English. She's Hungarian. And the spiritualist just waffled on for a few minutes and claimed that he lost the connection. And Houdini was so disillusioned in that moment, he just decided then and there that all spiritualists were charlatans and thieves. And for anyone who doesn't know, Harry Houdini was just his stage name. He was born Eric Weiss. Spiritualism is still widely practiced today, both by independent mediums and those in affiliations with groups such as the National Spiritualist Association of Churches in the United States. In Great Britain, the Spiritualist National Union has been the dominant organisation since the 1890s. Mediums continue to ply their trade on television and on podcasts and via websites and in private practice. They also continue to attract derision from some, complete faith and trust from others, and shrugs from the indifferent. How one perceives them depends, to a large degree, on what perception one has over things that go bump in the night. So thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found it interesting. I certainly found it interesting to record. As mentioned, this video was based on an original article submitted by a member of our team of writers, Larry Holsworth. Thank you to them. I hope everyone out there is enjoying their spooky season. Hope you have a very nice Halloween day. And I would be remiss if I didn't share a spooky story of my own. So my tone throughout this video has been, quite dismissive of the idea of communicating with ghosts, but that's not to say I'm a non-believer. My mother, for example, is a firm believer in the idea of ghosts and spirits and communicating with the dead. And she swears on my own life that the following story I'm about to recount happened as I'm going to say it. So, the reasons that I don't really feel the need to get into, my younger sister was not expected to survive birth, but she did so anyway. And shortly prior to her being born, my grandmother passed. And my grandmother had spent many, many months on her deathbed, just telling my mother, it's okay, the baby's going to be okay, the baby's going to be okay, I'll make sure it's okay. Passed away, a few complications that I don't want to get into, my mother's privacy happened, and my sister miraculously survived them and was born. The day she gets brought back from the hospital, my mum walks through the threshold of her home, and all the lights go absolutely apeshit. Like, they're flashing, the lights are blinking on and off, my electrical devices are turning on and off. My mum is in hysterics. She turns to my sister's dad, my stepdad, and says, it's my mum. I know it's my mum. She's here. Why is she here? My stepdad strolled into the house and exclaimed at the top of his voice, Tammy, my grandmother's name, you're scaring your daughter. Jamie, my sister, is fine. You don't need to be here anymore. You can go. All the lights turned off. Massive, all the fuses blew. That was it. And at the same time that was happening, the lights were also flashing in my mother's sister's house and her dad's house. So, the widow of her mother. And that she claims to this day that was her mother communicating with her to let her know that she was okay and that my sister was going to be fine. And I would be remiss if I didn't tell that story because, it's spooky season, time for scary stories. And if you've got your own scary story or encounter with the occult, the unknown, or a spooky ghost, let us know in the comments. And like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, have the day you deserve.